Hey, welcome to Ed, a podcast about the teaching life. This is Conversation 81, and I'm your host, Shane Lawrence. Ed is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network powered by ATB. And before we get rolling, a piece of exciting news. Ed is going to have its first ever live show. That's a show with a live audience. It's happening at the NCTCA Teachers Conference on February 7th at CKUA at 10 o'clock. Synchronize your watches. Hope you'll be there. There's going to be food, there's going to be prizes, and of course, a scintillating conversation featuring myself and some of the regular panelists that you have listened to over the last couple of years. That's February 7th, 10 o'clock, CKUA. Hope to see you there. And now let's get over to my conversation with teacher, gamification expert, and podcaster Rob Alvarez. Well, Rob, thank you very much for joining me today. I know this is, your time is valuable, so I appreciate it.
Thanks to you for the invitation. I'm always happy to go onto other people's podcasts. I enjoy the whole medium in general, and I'm happy to participate always that's possible for me.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad you're here with me. And speaking of being here with me, you are nowhere near where I am right now. You are in Spain right now?
Yes, in Madrid, in fact.
Yes, not right now. I make it sound like you're on vacation. That's where you live.
Yes, indeed.
So are you native to Spain?
Nope. Actually, I am from Latin America. I'm from a country called Venezuela. You might have heard of it from not the good things, but the bad ones.
Yeah, I've been here.
It also has a beautiful climate and many other things. But, right now we're famous for other things.
Yeah, unfortunately, but yes. So what finds you in Madrid, Spain then?
My now wife and I left Venezuela. We left home a few years ago. Now it's around 5 years ago because of the whole situation back home, economics, etc. We made it here, and it was a dream come true, to be honest. I had always looked forward to education and the whole education world, and I started working at a university as soon as I arrived. Wow. So it was landing in the right place. I'm pretty happy about that.
Yeah, that's quite a big change to make. That's geographically speaking, that's a long distance to be covering.
Yeah, and it seems like you'd think that we both speak Spanish and it's the same language, and not really. I don't know how different, a North American English is from, Australian or South African. I think in general, there are differences for sure, but I don't know if there's big differences. But in Spanish, I've realized I kind of knew beforehand, even in Latin America, you can see many different Spanish versions, but in Spain you get differences that are funny in general. I mean, you get to understand each other perfectly, but you get some funny situations where, for example, something that is that here it means that back home it means like having these like pants for men or women. Here they mean women's underwear. So you get funny situations from that for sure. Yeah. So those kinds of things happen very, very often with Spanish and the different cultures. It's a lot of fun, but you get into situations you might not want to be in every once in a while.
Suddenly there's a conversation just kind of stops and everyone's staring at you. You're like, what did I say?
Yes, that's happened.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Rob, you are obviously on the show because you're an educator. Can you tell me a little bit about what you do in that part of the world?
So I started to work here at the university at IE Business School like 5 years ago, around 5 years ago. And I started especially as a staff. I worked a lot with educators. I wasn't an educator myself back in the day. What we did, and we still do, I still do that as well, is we created interactive learning materials for our professors. And now not only for our professors, but also for professors all around the world. These materials are especially for business schools. That's our specialty. And I started teaching as well, quantitative methods and gamification, both very, very different subjects, but two things that I'm pretty passionate about as well. And that's what I've been doing. I've been like side or part-time teaching as much as I can, as my job allows me as well. But I'm enjoying it very, very much. It's something back in the university, I gave some. It's called it's like a lab kind of job that I had. So I kind of gave classes to other students while I was a student. So the idea is that they had a main professor who gave the whole classes and stuff, and we had like exercises. That's something I did at the university, and then at my master's degree I did it as well. And they were both around math, statistics, and microeconomics. So it's kind of full circle that I'm now teaching quantitative methods and managerial decision making and these kinds of things.
just from my own knowledge, what is quantitative method?
I was waiting for that question.
In 25 words or less. Is that fair?
So the idea is that I mean I would say that I had a lawyer this period that just ended, and he said something very interesting at the start of my class. I always ask them what's their objective by taking this class, and by taking I mean they have to take it. So I just want to get them more engaged into the class, and I asked all of them, and this lawyer's answer was, I want to be in this class and stop being afraid of numbers. So that gives you an idea of what do we do. We have several things like linear programming, so optimizing for profits, for example. We have also things like decision trees. So you have probable situations, and you use the probabilities to decide what's your best course of action. Mm-hmm. And then things that are very related to statistics, so like regression models. We do the whole statistics in general, very, very general. The idea is to get more deeper into regressions and simulations. Mm-hmm. So those are like the main topics that I teach in that subject.
That sounds absolutely terrifying.
Ask my students, it is. Yeah, I can't say it's not. They have a very diverse background, both from a subject perspective and from a cultural perspective. So this time I had 52 students, of which I would say something around 30 nationalities and probably like 27 professions or something like that. Wow. So I have, again, anything from lawyers to engineers to it's an MBA. It's an MBA kind of program. It's a managerial program. So I have people who studied management, finance, and then I have people who studied engineering, people who studied communications, all the full range. It's full range. And the school is super international as well, which is very exciting. Right. And it's very challenging as well. I mean, culturally, there's one of the things that I'm supposed to grade them on is participation. And it's not the same for, say, an American in general, North American, South American, to participate in a class and to ask questions and to say things in a class than, for example, for an Asian kid. It's very, very, very different. And it's super challenging to be able to put them on the same scale because, again, culturally, it's very different. The way that you approach, and I'm quoting here, authority. I don't like to see myself as, the authority here. I'm the guy who knows, and you're the guys who are learning. Yeah. But it kind of is in a way, and that's what they perceive, and that's the way they behave as well.
Yeah. I remember, just learning about Asian students, and they're just trained to not say anything. You just write down everything that comes out of the teacher's mouth, basically.
Yes.
So, yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting that, down in the muck here where I teach in the, high school, we talk about differentiation. I mean, I never really thought about it being an issue in university or post-secondary, but that's interesting. Of course, the other half of your teaching gig, I guess, and I hate to disappoint you, but this is really why you're on the show, not for quantitative method, is the gamification side of things. It's something that I've dipped my toes in here and there, but never. It feels like something that you just got to come out of the gate screaming to actually make it work, because it always strikes me as something really huge and daunting. But anyways,
that's one of the things that my own podcast works to help other people with. So whatever, just shoot and make your questions. I'm happy to be of any help for you and your audience if possible. Well, let's
back up the truck here, because I mean, I let all my insecurities just kind of out on the airwaves here, because that's just, I guess, my mode of being. But gamification, how did you even get into that? Because that's nothing that I don't think that anyone actually, it was never part of my education as being trained as an educator. So how did you come upon that path?
Long story short, I had a talk last year in 2007. Well, last year, so 2017 Gamification Europe. There's a video on YouTube about that where I talk about the whole story. But it probably started when I was playing Nintendo when I was like 7 years old, and I wanted to work for the Nintendo magazine. So the next best thing when you grow up is to use the lessons from games for something that is not a game, basically. And that's I don't know if I think you mentioned Scott Hebert, that he was on your show before. Is that right?
Yeah. He lives a stone's throw from where I work, actually. So yeah, we've connected a couple times.
Yeah. So I guess he's also given you some insights into that. So the idea is that you take the lessons that you learn from games, again, whether or not you're a gamer. There's a lot of discussion on whether people who are not gamers are able to do this or not. I do believe that there's many things you can learn, even if you're not like a super serious gamer or whatever, which I have to say I'd never considered myself. I wouldn't have been if I tried to compete in those, esports and those things, and they existed back in the day. I would have probably been miserable because I wouldn't have made it the cut. So I can't say I'm like a very great gamer or I play all the time. So I do think it's something very accessible, and that's kind of where it started. I started loving education as I grew into my career, and then I realized when I arrived here and did this job that I'm doing right now as well in this department, that what they've been doing for, and they say they because they've been doing it for 17 years already, is maybe a sort of gamification without calling it that way, and maybe it wasn't directly conscious. So one of the things I've done when I realized that this was a thing and that it already existed around, and that there was some research being done around this subject, is that I started to make it conscious. I started reading, I started understanding all of these things and bringing all these concepts. And it came to me. I just realized that we were doing gamification, that we could do it a lot better as well. And I started bringing it into the department, talking about it. I went to conferences to talk about what we were already doing, the things that we were planning to do. And that's basically how I arrived to it. And to finish that, in that sense, the story, I also decided to start my podcast, as I mentioned before, because I was thinking, we started giving our not sharing exactly, but because it's a business school and they charge for it, but we started using our materials as well in other business schools. And I said, well, besides doing it in other places and the people are able to pay or not, how else can we spread the word and let people know that there's something called gamification that can be done in an amazing way, and where I can actually myself add value? And the medium of podcasting came directly into my mind. And that's when I decided to start this podcast called Professor Game. And I've been doing it for over a year now.
Right on. Right on. Well, I mean, I completely agree that, a podcast is a fantastic form of professional development for yourself and for hopefully the listeners.
Ideally.
Ideally. I know there's some days I'm just like, I'm sorry, everybody. Here's this thing. But not today. So what is it about gamification that actually captured you? Because you say, you dove into books and whatever else. I mean, normally one doesn't do that unless, it's more than just, a work, my words are broken today, man. This is terrible. Directive. It's more than just a work directive for you. Obviously, this is something you're really passionate about. What is it that sucks you in with gamification? This week's episode of Ed is brought to you by ATB's Transformation Alpha Beta. ATB Financial is on a mission to transform banking by making it work for people. They do this through their customer obsession and by innovating at the forefront of robotics, AI, blockchain, and the future. Visit atbalphabeta.com to learn more. All right, let's get back to me and Rob.
There's two things. I mean, the first one, and I always like to mention this as well. I do believe, I believe that there's an engagement crisis in education in general. I mean, I'm talking first grade education, higher ed, master's degrees, etc. There is certainly an engagement problem in education, especially when you talk about education in places that are not everything is figured out economically, but you are in an okay-ish situation. Like your needs are sufficiently covered, because if you turn around and you look at, for example, at Africa, you look back home, like into where I come from, you could argue that, that's not even a problem. You need is more schools and more people to be able to access school. And that's completely true. I can't argue with that, but I also, at least currently, I'm not able to help too much in that problem. So I'm trying to help on the other side of the problem as well, which is what I've seen and I've observed a lot, and is what I call the engagement crisis. I think it was Scott and I that we discussed it, and I heard it for the first time. I completely agree with that, and I hadn't put it into words, but I do think that there is an engagement crisis. I mean, when you see students yawning, the problem is not whether students are able to answer a worksheet. The question is whether they care, whether it's actually useful for them in the future, or whether they even understand if it's going to be useful for them. And falling back, I know I'm not here about quantitative methods, but it's that kind of subject that students struggle with understanding how it'll be useful for them in the future, or maybe not, but at least understanding the basic concepts is very useful for them to be able to talk, in my case, to other business people who will be working with them. So getting that through, I do think that gamification has a lot to offer to education so that students are engaged with their learning. And there's, of course, not through gamification, but the whole engagement and the capacity for learning. That is something that has a lot of research behind it. I mean, it's not the same for somebody to say, I'm in this class and, I don't care what happens. How much can you learn from that is very, very limited versus I'm super excited to be here for whatever reason. And I'm like, my mind is more open to receiving information, to exchanging with my fellow students. All of these are elements that can be achieved through well-designed gamification and through elements that can be from the most complicated and complex video game to simple elements such as social relatedness, simple things such as giving people a greater purpose than just why do you have to add and understand how to add? Why do you have to understand why is history important for students? Why are quantitative methods important for students? Giving it a greater meaning, even if just for a second, for a few minutes, and getting them to be engaged with that is something that can change completely the panorama when you talk about disengaged students, which is something that I have to say I've seen very, very often.
Right. So is gamification, if we're going to boil it down, is it fair to say that it's just a method of incentivizing learning? Or is it more than that?
Incentivizing, the only problem with, I agree with the definition in itself. The problem is the word of incentivizing, because when you say incentivizing, it could be implying more something of giving away rewards and that kind of thing. And it's not always, I mean, rewards can be good and they can be awesome. We've been giving them, and education has been in that sense gamified since forever, giving them stickers and stars and all those things, and even points. If you think about your grades, it's actually points, and you could be saying that you're giving them feedback and all those things. The difference is that I would say it's not just about incentivizing, it's about getting people excited about it or engaged with whatever it is that you're doing. I think that's one of the main things that gamification can bring forth for education. That's something I certainly would agree with.
So getting them to actually want to do whatever it is you want them to do, regardless of whether they get a candy at the end then.
Exactly. And that's the point. I mean, because it's kind of easy, at least for the first couple of tries, to just say, well, whoever, if you want people to talk more in class and say something in the class, you say every time somebody raises their hand and says something interesting, I'll give them a candy. And it will work for a while, and that's kind of sort of gamification in a way, but it's just going to work for a while. You need to do something. I mean, you can do that to kickstart, but you have to think about deeper things so that students get to continue in that, because you don't want to do it for 1, 2, or 3 classes. You probably want to do it for your whole year if you have a year-long class, or for your whole period or semester, whatever it is. And it's certainly not going to work for 10, 20, 30, 40 classes. It's definitely not going to work for that long.
So, I mean, I'll fess up. I wouldn't say I'm a hardcore gamer. I was at one point. I have no time for that anymore. But I mean, literally 10 minutes before the show, I was just wrapping up a little session of Tomb Raider. And it just gets me thinking about all the different systems that are in place in a game. So what kind of systems do you borrow from, games? And it might not be video games. Maybe it's other board gaming or whatever, but what kind of systems are you borrowing, laying on top of education in order to make this thing work?
I would say that there are like 2 main things that I would bring always to education. And one of them, and it's very, very important, is the whole thing of theme or storytelling or narrative. There's many ways to talk about it, but the important thing is, again, and it depends on who your audience is. If you have very young kids, the theme is probably going to be a bit more for younger kids. If you have people like myself, that I have these students who are starting like at 22 to 27 years old was what I just had. I'm going to have a bit older students now. There will be probably until like 35 years old. It's 27 to 35. Even if you have those differences there, if you are able to bring in a theme, and again, in my class, it could be the theme could be business, and how do you embed this into business? It is not about how do you understand how to do the mean of and the statistics of a certain bunch of data. It's what does that mean for business? So you take that theme and you bring it into your class, and it's not about the topic that you're teaching. It's about the business. And of course, you have to do all these statistical things and this linear programming, all these things for the business. But the central theme or topic of your class is the business. And that's just an example. Mm-hmm. Another example that I could give you is when finishing the last period, we had a review class where we were talking about all the things that we had been seeing on the period. And what I did was I said, you know what, we're going to do something completely different. I mean, they were used to being in the class, intervening, reading their case studies, and then talking in the class, etc. And I said, well, this time you're not going to sit down. You're going to do an escape room. So we did an escape room themed with Marvel. So the idea is that they had clues all over the room. Uh-huh. They saw the clues. The clues led them to problems, which were about these superheroes. But the problems were, of course, solved through quantitative methods. So that's a very, I wouldn't say simple, because it does require a bit of work as well. But those problems are problems that you will use anyway. All I did was reskin many of the problems and change things like, oh, this is about, winter coats. And instead of saying winter coats, I said, well, this exercise is going to be about the Hulk and the Thing are having a fight, and who is going to be stronger. And that you completely change that, and you're just changing titles. And I put a couple of comics around the classroom, etc. And that was it. It became an escape room. They had to go through a series of clues. They were grouped into their teams. They had to do it together. They had to find all the clues, and they had to resolve the exercises. And actually, they were able to solve 5 exercises from all the topics, things that they would have never expected to solve in such a time. And that's like the power of gamification, as I see it. When students are able to realize that they're actually able to do a lot more than they expected that they would be able to do.
It sounds like you really have to, or the students at least have to have a bit of imagination as well to really grab onto this kind of thing.
Yes and no. It's very. I mean, as any teacher like yourself and any professor knows, it very much depends on where you place them as well. Because we are as educators, we are game designers. Even though we don't realize, we might have not realized at some point, we're all game designers. Our whole class is a game, whether it's well designed or not. It's up to us.
Oh man, I love that.
Because if you want to see it that way, and if you take that perspective, you're assigning points to your students for the actions that they're doing. Yeah. That's exactly what games do. I mean, games you're moving around and you're getting points or badges, or you're getting feedback. Things are happening due to the actions that you commit. And that's exactly what happens in the classroom. And how do you think about the motivation of students for committing those actions? When you start taking that perspective, it's not just about the content, which I'm sure all of the teachers and professors that are listening right now, I'm sure you handle your content beautifully, probably better than I do, for sure, because you've been doing it for more years and you do it more often than I do. The thing that I invite you to do, if you're not doing it already, is to think about not only the content, but how to get it through to your students. What motivates them, where they're at. Why do they want to be in your class? Why would they want to engage with your class beyond it being, mandatory, or because their parents dumped them there? Because that's the way kids sometimes see themselves in school. Our parents just dump us there in this sort of jail where we can't escape, so we have to go to class. So if that's a situation where your students perceive they are, what are you going to do about it? Sit them down, get them to be silent, which is okay. I think the classroom has to have some level of order. But why would they want to be there? If they had it as an option, why would they be there? If they had to pay for being in your class, would somebody pay to be in your class? Why? And there's many ways in which you can get to that point and that level. And it takes baby steps. And that's what, when you were talking at the beginning, that it's a huge, like mind shift, etc. Yes, it could be a huge mind shift. But you start with one single step. And there's many, many resources out there to help you in taking that first step. I mean, I've heard at least twice his example of what he suggested, a professor, of saying that, do something completely different. Like, say that this professor was known for her mug, and at some point she said it disappeared. It didn't really disappear. She just took it out of her place and gave it to the principal. So they had like this whole adventure of finding out where the mug was, and finally they busted into the principal's office, in which he, of course, who knew that they were coming, and was sipping of the mug and like laughing, like, you caught me. And that just completely changed the feel of the classroom. Of course, you can try to have it more related to your content, or you can just do that to get your kids excited and then, get them to feel a bit more inside your class. I would suggest always try to link it as much as you can to your content. Mm-hmm. But even if you do just those small things, you realize the excitement that comes from that. And there's an image that I was at there was a conference here in Madrid like 3 years ago. Was called the Gamification World Conference, and there was this nun. I mean, you wouldn't think of anything more traditional and in our heads more boring than a nun school. That's the typical image that you imagine. And this lady, this was an international conference in English. She doesn't speak English, and she was invited to this conference to talk about her experience, because what they did in their school was absolutely incredible. I mean, just looking at the pictures, the kids had their backpacks on because they were so excited that they didn't even realize that they hadn't left their backpacks in their drawers or wherever they had to leave them. They were all jumping over the desk of the teacher, trying to look at the map that she was showing them. And the and I think that one was a geography class. And then they had another class where people were like jumping all over the place. And it's not, again, about order or disorder. It's about the excitement that the kids had. You could even have a lot of order within all that excitement that you have. Mm-hmm. And it's perfectly acceptable to have a little bit of disorder if that gets your students to learn more and to be willing to learn. I don't know if you had that experience in the university or in school, that you studied so much for a subject and like 2 weeks later, you remembered nothing.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
I mean, that happens all the time. What if it was a memorable experience? Would you have forgotten that easily? Not the test, the semester, the professor, what they taught, what you learned from that person. Those are the things that you don't forget. Not what you study for a test. And I have my grudge against tests, even though I have to do them myself.
Yeah.
But tests only go so far. How do you provide a memorable experience so that whatever it is you're teaching, which I'm sure is super useful for your students' life, is actually remembered and it goes somewhere in their minds? And that's what I feel gamification is all about. And that's what there's many resources out there. Again, there's books, there's blogs, there's podcasts, there's many places where you can go and refer to. And that's what my personal invitation is, to go out there and look for those resources, because there are many, many, many good ones. There's many, I don't know, there's frameworks, there's people, for example, there's people who say what are the profiles of your players. There's many ways to see your students as players, and what are the different profiles? How do you get those different profiles excited? How do you understand your players better? There's many, many, many things out there. I just don't want to bombard too much information at once, but there's many things that you can get into to understand these small things, small steps. And something super, super important, just like any game designer, you have to experiment. And by experiment, I'm not talking about, human experiments that are putting anybody's life in jeopardy. Yeah. I mean, you have to test. You have to do things. You have to make assumptions. I think this will work. I think I'm doing all these things. And then you go out there with your students and test it. And you can even be super transparent and say, look, this is the first time I'm doing this. Help me out. If there's anything you feel is wrong, let's discuss it after the class and see how we can make it better. Those kinds of things work. I mean, in my escape room experience, I told them up front, this is the first time that we do this. Let me know what you think. I made many mistakes that I learned from them. The escape room, I have to say, was a good side of it. Other things were not as good, but that was my fault. And I learned a lot from that experience. And that's something that we have to do often. Experiment, test new things and see how they work, or if they don't work, what didn't work, why didn't it work, what's out there, what other things can I change to make it better? Or can I fall back to what I did before? Is that better? Why did I change it in the first place? I probably had something that didn't work. those are the kind of questions I invite everybody to make, not every day, of course, because you have to move on with life, but you have to make those questions every once in a while and say, well, what if I test this out? What's the worst thing that can happen?
I wonder. It seems to me like, I mean, a lot of these questions you're asking, regardless of whether you are, consciously, gamified in your room, those are great questions to ask regardless. I mean, you always want to be trying to improve and make things better. And I mean, you just blew my mind when you said it's not, no, I said, as educators, we're game designers, whether the game is well designed or not. Like that just like, my brain exploded when you said that. But the other thing I'm picking up on here too, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like, and again, you're talking to a major like gamification-ophobe. Is that a word? The level of commitment that it would take to do that, just, it scares me off a lot of the time. I have, like I said, I've dabbled with it, but from what you're saying is that, I mean, you could gamify a unit or an assignment or even just like a single day.
Yeah. Definitely. That's something I could definitely do. And I'm a very good example of that. I literally did an escape room for a single session with my students in the last period. I'm not going to say you go all in. Some people are very, I don't want to say brave or not brave, because I don't mean to intend that other of us are not brave, but that they're more willing to experiment. They maybe have more room for that, and they decided to go just all in and make a full year completely gamified, or they did a full game for their students. And that's amazing, because you learn, the learning curve is very steep, and you go higher a lot faster. But of course you break more things when you do that a lot faster in that learning curve. And some people are more willing to do that, and that's okay. Some people say, well, you know what, I don't want to break so many things. I don't want to be the elephant in the Chinese shop. So you can take small baby steps. I mean, you can go out and test small things, see how they work. Some things will not work. That's something that you have to know in advance. Even if you test them out, you try it and you say, oh, this didn't work very well. It's not because gamification doesn't work or because using a game in your class doesn't work. It's because that thing that you did or that you tested out or that somebody else did and worked, it just doesn't work for you and your class. That's it. That's the only thing that it means. And we're very intentional here about talking about the whole, there's platforms for gamification, which can be fantastic, but you always have to think, how do I design my game, my gamification for the people I am creating it for? Because the platforms are fantastic, but if you just plug and play and you forget about who you're designing it for and expect for them to have thought about that, you're probably not going to have a good time. And again, that's a learning curve. You say, oh, this probably would motivate an audience. And again, I spoke about my students in Asia. Maybe the students in Asia would be super motivated by this, but my students are from North America. So I have to think about what motivates them and why are they different. So those small nuances, those small things are things that you have to think about, test out, and see how they work for your students. And make them better, because they're always improvable. Yeah,
different games for different audiences. The one thing I want to try see if we can unpack it a little more too is just you mentioned storytelling. I mean, I'm a big fan of infusing story into classrooms. So how does that work for you? Like, what do you do that works well in terms of the storytelling aspect of gamification?
I'm going to give you an example, not of what I teach, because, I can give you an example of what I teach as well, but I'm going to start with something that I experienced myself. Okay. In primary school, I used to hate history, literally. I mean, it was the worst subject for you to put me in a class in. I hated it. I then realized why I hated it. The whole point of history, at least how they taught me, was to learn the order of all these dates. I never understood what it meant. It was never exciting until I arrived to like 6th grade, where they sort of force you because you're just there and you have to. But they made us do an expo, and we had to choose our own historical event and do something about it. And what we did was we recreate. Not what we did. I did something else. But the friend right next to me, he recreated a battle of independence that happened. And he made a whole board with the horses and all the things happening at once. And what he did when people came to his place was explain them how it all worked. And that's history as well. Like understanding how those battles of independence worked, That's part of history. And if you broaden the picture and you start looking back and you say, well, how do all of these events interconnect between themselves? Christopher Columbus arrived to America the 12th of October of 1492, whatever that is.
Yeah.
But what does that mean? What changed? What was going on? How did people's lives change? What are all those interconnections? What are the stories of people? Maybe you focus on one single, Native American who was there and whose life changed and what happened, and then his children, and take people through this narrative of history, which is absolutely fascinating. Or you take Alexander the Great and you go through his life and understand how he conquered the Persian, etc. But it's not just about he went from Macedonia to and name one after the other and what were the years and what were the countries. Mm-hmm. It's about the story, what happened, why did he go to this place and not that place. It becomes a lot more exciting and you get a lot more information that way, and you're actually excited about getting that information. So that's a very simple-ish example of what I see the huge difference between a storytelling way of getting the information through versus what I was used to back in the day, that history meant, or geography and all these things. That's what it meant for me. Social studies were so boring because they didn't include all of these super rich elements. And we could take many examples, but again, the other thing that I could say is the other thing that we use, at least in business schools, are very used, is we use what they call the case study methodology.
Right.
So instead of just saying you have this problem here, add these things here, and subtract and do the operations that you're supposed to do, you tell them a situation. So you say, well, there's this guy who has, it's called, one of them is, for example, the golden ruby case. Mm-hmm. So there's this guy who has this the silver, well, there's a silver shoe and the golden ruby. There's two differences. The golden ruby one is this lady who has a jewelry shop, and she has all of these materials and she has these limitations. She has all this labor that she has, and you have to help her figure out how many necklaces she's going to do, how many rings she's going to do, and how many there's another element that you have to do as well with the labor that she has, with the restrictions that she has, to maximize profit. There's a very, very, very big difference between that and just giving them a bunch of data and saying, do your optimization problem here. Massive. And they have to read a little bit more. They have to understand more things. They have to go deeper. But they can be excited about what they are learning. I'm not saying they will be just because you give them a story. But if you present it in the right way, if you make it have a meaning, if you help them understand why that's important, they can even be excited about that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think we are wired for story. So, I mean, you give social studies as, sort of the example of like discovering the story within the content. And, I mean, I'm just putting things together here right now, but I'm thinking, for subjects where story isn't inherent, like math, quantitative analysis, then gamification allows you to have a narrative, and therefore it's easier to connect different concepts. It's easier to care about the outcome.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's even I just had an interview with one of the winners of an award in a conference I went to recently. She is Naomi Pariseau from Brown University, and they won an award because they did a online course that was fully gamified. And you can almost laugh because you say, well, it's about literature. Making a storytelling about literature should be super easy because literature is in general full of stories. Mm-hmm. So, well, yeah, you can say that, but how long have you been teaching literature without storytelling as well? Mm. I mean, it's not just giving you a book and saying, read it and give me a report. Mm-hmm. That's not storytelling. The storytelling is in the book. It's not in the class that you're teaching. Yeah. And these people, they made a full course. The idea was to get this sort of humanoid to understand the human culture through all of the literature that they're supposed to read. So now all of the assignments that they were given in the class had a purpose and a meaning. They were to help this humanoid understand and all the feelings, and this humanoid was special. I think she understood things through numbers or something like that. It was a very curious thing. And they encountered typically the problem that the students had this assignment, which was super complex because You don't, it's something like you have to give a software a reading and just take it from the software. Students were like super confused. Why would I do that? That's super weird. That doesn't make sense. And
Yeah.
then instead of just giving them that option, they said, well, you have to help. I can't remember the name of the humanoid. It's something like, I don't know, let's call her Stella. You have to help Stella understand all of these things. And the only way that she's able to understand it is through this machine. It's like, okay, now you're not asking why, you're asking, how do I do it?
Right.
And when you change that question from why would I even be doing this multiplication and division to how do I do it because I have to help Stella understand all of these things, you're flipping the whole script. I mean, people are there because they want to be, and they're engaged with trying to solve this problem, even for somebody else, because that's part of human nature as well.
Well, and I think what's inherent in all these examples too is that you're giving students a role beyond student. Right. You are now having to teach Stella how to learn these things, or you're now, a storyteller yourself. You're a problem solver. You are, any number of these things. And, I accidentally stumbled across this just because I thought, well, this would be interesting. And I had my students, just as part of a novel study that gave them a story about how they got stuck in the school. And, I actually, part of the story, which they loved, is that I got locked outside and I died. In a horrible way. And they thought that was just the best thing ever. So maybe, I don't know, maybe students don't like me as much as I think they do. Anyway, but it surprised me because I walked out in the hallway after the bell had gone and even the next day and listening in the hallways, and they're talking about this assignment they have to do, where they have to get into teams and figure out who's got what roles and have to write about them. And they have to, I had kids like, they had to figure out how to survive, and they were not breaking into, but, going into the school store and saying, well, what goods are here that we can use, and how long can we live on that? How many calories do I need to survive in a day? And like, it was nuts to see that happen. But it was because, as you said, that they had something to do. They had a reason to do it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And that's a beautiful example of something that you did that I would consider gamification.
Yeah, I do now, but it was a total accident at the time.
Well, there you go. I mean, those are small things that you do and that change the script for you. And that's, again, it's about, for me, one of the main elements, again, is storytelling, but it's about thinking, what is the problem that you have that you want to solve in a better way with your students, which I would argue in general tends to be engagement, but it could be many other things. And then who are your students? Why are they there? How do you get to motivate them? How do you get to engage them? And then, of course, you can pull from many types of elements like storytelling. You can pull from elements from games like using, the typical points, badges, and leaderboards, which are not the holy grail at all. There's many other things, but you can use the whole social elements. I mean, you just mentioned that they had different roles. I don't know if you're familiar with World of Warcraft. Mm-hmm. It's not about having just the strongest warrior. You need a strong warrior, but you also need a healer. You also need all sorts of characters to work together to be able to defeat the big villains and the big bad guys. That's the only way that you can do it. And of course, if only one guy can do the whole thing, it's a different type of game. If you want your students to work together in teams and to work and to collaborate, well, give them a reason to collaborate, which is not, I am telling you that you have to work in groups. Because what typically happens in a group, and if groups are larger than 2 or 3, there's 1 or 2, maybe luckily 3, who actually do the whole work, and the rest are slacking off, or they're for whatever reasons they might have a deal in which they do these jobs and the other ones do the other jobs. But the idea that what you want is for everybody to be involved, so give them a reason to be involved.
Right, and even like crafting the projects in such a way that they can't be done by one person alone.
Yeah.
So
it
just provides a natural pushback. I like that.
Absolutely. And there's many ways in which you can think of that. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember who it was mentioning that when you have, your weaker students who nobody wants to work with because he or she, I'm not sure, I think it was a he, used very strong words like, everybody knows who's the stupid guy in the classroom and nobody wants to work with him or her. And well, take that student who is already in a group and give them something that the other ones need so that they are involved. And there you will see how that student will start overperforming what you expected from him or her.
Right. I like that.
And the top students are actually going to need the lower students, and that's where they work together and they learn from each other, because that's another element that we could talk about as well, which is learning from each other. It's not just about us, the holy educators who know everything, because we don't in general. It's also about what they can learn from each other, especially when it's in higher education, that there's people who have had a work life as well. They have already been into the world out there. They can learn from each other's experiences. That's something that happens. And even in the classroom, there's people who are maybe in a more advanced class. They have had different life experiences. They have understood, like their dad is an accountant, so they understand better what all these things are for. Whatever it is, they can learn from each other. That's something that we do all the time. And when we not just learn together, but from each other, the learning is so much more powerful.
Awesome. I'm sold.
Let's do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Rob, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insight. This has been actually really informative. Doesn't begin to describe it, but it's definitely put a lot in my head that I find very valuable. So thank you.
Thanks to you for the invitation, Shane.
Is there anything else you wanted to add before we cut this off?
If anybody's curious about the things in gamification, there's many resources out there. Of course, I will recommend people to listen to my podcast, which is and will continue to be absolutely free. It's called Professor Game. You can find it on the webpage, professorgame.com. You can find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, wherever you listen to this podcast, you can listen to it as well. And I would be very, very happy to welcome you to that audience, the engagers. And we're trying to create more and more resources for you to be able to use to implement gamification in your classroom. We're talking about people that are in the classrooms as professionals. That we have consultants as well, so that we can see like from the different worlds. And of course, we recommend books, we recommend frameworks, we recommend talks. There's many things that you can get from. And again, that's my podcast. There are many podcasts out there talking about, well, many. There's a few podcasts as well talking about gamification. In the classroom, not too many, but there's at least one more, which I know of. I don't know if you've heard of Michael Matera.
I've seen the name.
Author of Explore Like a Pirate, I think is the name of his book.
Yeah.
He's very, very good as well. I mean, he's very, very good. He's been running about the same time I have, and he's absolutely amazing. That's a podcast I would certainly recommend if you're into education. But go out there, look for these resources. I mean, there's many free stuff out there that you can get your hands on if you're willing to commit a little bit more and put some money into that. There's absolutely fantastic resources that are out there as well. Just go for it. That's my definite advice for any educators listening to this podcast.
Right on. Dive in. Anywhere else that people can get in touch with you if they want to just get more information?
Sure. Yeah. I have Twitter, Instagram. I'm Rob Alvarez B. That's my second last name. Here in the Latin countries, we use two last names for some weird reason I still don't understand, but I have my second last name in there as well. So Rob Alvarez B, the letter B, both in Twitter and Instagram. I have a Facebook page it's not as active as the other social media. You can find me there. You can find me on the webpage. There's a contact form. I have an email list where I send some updates as well. And there's many places where you can find me. My name is Rob Alvarez, and you can look that in the internet, and especially if you put Professor Game, you'll find quite a few things around in the internet.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's awesome.
Thanks to you. I'm really happy to have been here. Let's do this often and talk about these interesting things more often.
Right on. I love it. When I dive into this a little more, I'll come back and tell you what did and did not work.
Yes, let's do an episode on that. Definitely.
Sounds great. All right. You take care, sir.
Same for you.
All right. Bye. This week's episode is also brought to you by the Alberta Podcast Network. It's a collection of Alberta-made shows that cover just about every topic under the sun. One such podcast is Press Start to Join. It's a twice-weekly podcast about video games, current events, technology, and pretty much anything else that catches the interest of its two hosts, Alan and Josh. You can check it out along with all the other great Alberta Podcast Network shows at albertapodcastnetwork.com. And if you want to get in touch or you'd like to be a guest on this show, you can email me at theedpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Twitter at theedpodcast. If you want to listen to more of Ed, you can head over to the website, theedpodcast.podbean.com, or find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcatcher of your choice. Just search up Ed Conversations. Ed can also be heard on VoiceEd Radio. It's 24-hour internet broadcasting devoted to the best ideas in education. Just head over to voiced.ca. So, on behalf of myself and Rob, thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.